How to read a Magic the Gathering card. There is often more to a Magic the Gathering card than what is printed on it, even accounting for relevant sections of the comprehensive rules. Every card needs to be considered in the context of the games it might be played in. Today, we are talking about part of the cat oven combo, the Witch's Oven. I wasn't sure if I should, as I just did a Throne of Eldraine card in episode 2, but I wanted to talk about an artifact card and touch on costs and tokens a bit more, and it was the first card that came to mind. I did do the old Scryfall advanced search to find a better example. The card Trading Post checked all of the boxes, but, too many boxes? Anyway, it's my series and I love Witch's Oven. Sure, that's partly because I hit Mythic in MTG Arena one time with the Luris Cat Oven deck, but also because it's an elegant example of how a seemingly simple card is actually a toolbox of functionality. As is tradition, let's review the details we've already covered that are relevant to this card. This card is named Witch's Oven. The casting cost is 1 generic mana, so mana value is 1. There are no colors anywhere on this card, so it has no color and its color identity is colorless. The card type is Artifact. Artifacts are permanent spells that tend to represent an object the wizard is summoning. Artifacts can be played by being cast at sorcery speed, namely anytime a player has priority and the stack is empty during a main phase on their own turn. Artifacts are cast to the stack and resolved to the battlefield under your control in the same way as creatures, enchantments, or planeswalkers. Some artifacts, like the Witch's Oven, have no other types, but there are also a number of artifact types, like equipment or vehicle, that have special rules tied to them. Equipment can be attached to a creature using the Equip or Reconfigure keyword ability, and vehicles can become creatures by tapping other creatures to the Crew keyword ability. Notice that the background of the frame is a silvery white color? Artifacts of all colors use that same background pattern, but with different piping color. I feel like the background might sometimes be tinted slightly depending on the card's color, but maybe that's my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe that's just the way it is in MTG Arena. White artifacts and colorless artifacts use very similar piping in the frame, so it's hard to tell them apart at first glance. That said, colorless artifacts have a silvery gray-blue background behind the text, while white cards typically use a off-white, aged parchment, old marble color for the text backgrounds. Colorless, non-land, non-artifacts sometimes have a transparent frame background. Take this as a reminder that the card frame, at best, is a reminder, and you are better off looking for explicit color indicators to determine a card's color and color identity. It is also relatively common for cards with other permanent types, like creature or land, to also have the artifact type. Permanents having the artifact type, similar to creatures having a creature type, doesn't matter on its own, but there are a number of situations in Magic the Gathering where the effects of another card will make it matter. One more thing about artifacts and frames. Notice artifact lands use the land background instead of the artifact background. Wait, one more thing. The frames for artifacts used to be brown. This is relevant again because they printed a bunch of retro frame artifacts in the Brothers' War. We can tell from the set symbol, and ELD in the footer, that this card is from the set Throne of Eldraine. We can tell from the silver or white color of the set symbol and the U in the footer that this card is uncommon. We also have art and, in italics, the flavor text. The wafting smells are both scrumptious and suspicious. These have no impact on the rules, but rather serve to give you an idea of what object this card might represent in the Magic the Gathering universe. The collector number is 237 out of 269, and the printing language is English. We also have a trademark and copyright notice from the publisher of Magic the Gathering, Wizards of the Coast, and the artist's credit. Witch's Oven has an activated ability. Activated abilities are abilities that a player can choose to activate by paying their activation cost. I spent a bit of time talking about spell speeds in a previous video, but practically speaking, you can try to activate an activated ability anytime you have priority. Let's look at that activated ability. It says, tap, sacrifice a creature, create a food token. If the sacrificed creature's toughness was 4 or greater, create 2 food tokens instead. First, we have a comma-separated list of costs, followed by a colon, and then finally the effects of this ability. Let's look at the costs. Tapping is a cost we've seen before on the implicit activated ability of the forest. The tap symbol implicitly means tap this permanent, and to tap a card as a cost, it needs to be untapped when you pay that cost. This is one time when timing is important because you might choose to activate an ability with a tap cost in response to another effect causing a permanent you control to be tapped or removed from the battlefield somehow. Your ability will go onto the stack first, thus be resolved first, Worth noting, while a permanent needs to be untapped if you want to tap it as a cost, effects that tap target permanent can target a tapped permanent. There are cases where a card's ability will need to tap or untap other permanents as a cost. Generally speaking, these costs will be phrased something like, tap an untapped permanent you control, but the key difference is that this is being done as a cost rather than an effect. On the subject of tap costs, I mentioned the summoning sickness rule in passing in a previous episode. As a reminder, an activated ability on a creature that requires that creature to tap itself cannot be activated unless that creature has been under your control continuously since you last began a turn. Since Witch's Oven isn't a creature, it can be tapped as soon as it comes under your control. Sacrificing means to destroy a permanent you control. Similar to tapping, you need to have an appropriate permanent to sacrifice if you are doing so to pay a cost, but effects that require players to sacrifice a permanent still happen even if you don't. In between costs that need to be paid and effects that happen regardless, we have the concept of targeting. While an effect that directs you to sacrifice 2 creatures will still happen if you only have 1 or fewer creatures, an effect that destroys 2 target creatures will only happen if you have at least 2 creatures to destroy. Over time, there have been adjustments made to the wording of these types of effect to get around this. A card might say, target player sacrifices whatever. If that player does, something happens. Paying costs to activate an ability, just like paying costs to cast a spell, happens simultaneously to activating the ability. There is no point where the action can be interrupted between when you declare that you are activating the ability, when you pay each of the required costs, when you choose targets for that ability, and when the effects of the ability are put onto the stack. That said, as mana abilities can be activated nearly any time, there are possible cases where other effects might change the board state such that an effect fizzles immediately. If this happens, the costs are not refunded. Choosing which creature to sacrifice isn't, technically speaking, targeting. This is important because it gets around cannot be targeted effects provided by Shroud or Protection keyword abilities. Now, let's look at the effects of Witch's Oven's activated abilities. Create a food token. If the sacrificed creature's toughness was 4 or greater, create 2 food tokens instead. Almost ready to talk about those food tokens, but first let's talk about effect resolution order. I mentioned in the previous video about emergency powers that the effects on a card happen in the order they appear, but this wasn't exactly the whole story. While emergency powers had 2 paragraphs, and each of these paragraphs are resolved in the order they appear on the card, the paragraphs themselves are treated as discrete effects, and each of the actions or calculations that need to happen in an effect are effectively resolved simultaneously unless they have a word like then. As such, emergency powers is sent to exile at the same time as the shuffling and the drawing. The reason that this is relevant here is that you need to read all the way to the end of the ability to know that you might create 2 food tokens instead of 1. We discussed the toughness of a creature in the episode about questing beast. The second number in the bottom right of a card is that card's toughness and represents how much damage a creature can have marked on it before it is destroyed. An interesting nuance to mention. The power and toughness printed on a card is sometimes referred to as a creature's base power and toughness. There are some effects that increase or decrease a creature's power and or toughness, like giant growth, and others that modify a creature's base power and or toughness, like Allosaurus Shepherd. The ability on Witch's Oven cares about the toughness of the creature at the time it was sacrificed, not the toughness printed on the card or the base toughness. Okay, so what's a food token? A token, as I mentioned last episode, is a permanent on the battlefield that isn't represented by a card. These can be copies of permanents, or they can be created explicitly by other game effects. When a card creates a token, it will either tell you everything about the token being created, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, or identify one of a number of predefined tokens. As stated in the reminder text, food tokens are artifacts with 2, tap, sacrifice this artifact. You gain 3 life. It is also colorless and has the permanent type artifact and the artifact type food. Token is not a card type, but it is a type of permanent, so you often have effects that specifically target token or non-token permanents. When playing paper magic, a token can be represented on the battlefield with pretty much anything that allows you to keep track of its position and orientation on the battlefield. anything from scraps of paper to ketchup packets to empty card sleeves to dry erase infinitokens. Wizards of the Coast will often include printed versions of the tokens that the cards in a given set might make in booster packs and other products for a set. These are cards in the rectangles of cardboard that are the same shape and size as a Magic card sense, but not in the sense that the comprehensive rules of Magic the Gathering define a card. A relatively recent change to the rules, as of the release of Innistrad Crimson Vow in 2021, is that, unless otherwise specified, a whatever token will now be treated as being named whatever token, so that Red Goblin creature token mentioned earlier would be named Goblin token, and a food token would be named Food token. This accommodates an edge case where a card effect would have previously implicitly created a token that had the same name as another spell. Effects can still, however, explicitly create tokens with specific names, as with Tatsunari Toad Rider creating tokens named Kami, and Ajani Strength of the Pride creating tokens named Ajani's Pridemate. The activated ability on a food token has a new wrinkle in timing. Its ability requires it to sacrifice itself. Just like when Emergency Powers exiles itself but leaves the remaining effects on the stack, so too does the food token cease to exist at the same time that the effect "you gain 3 life" is put onto the stack. This is because paying the cost to activate an ability, activating the ability, and putting the effects of the ability on the stack all happen simultaneously from the perspective of the game state. As mentioned in a previous episode, the most common way to lose a game of Magic the Gathering is to reach 0 or fewer life, so the obvious use of a food token is to gain life. Gaining life isn't the best thing you can do with 2 mana most of the time. You don't typically win games of Magic the Gathering by just getting rid of your own creatures and gaining a little life. That said, there are times when you are down to your last life point, and doing so will prevent you from losing. Let's take a moment to discuss context. There are times when you can read and understand every word of the Oracle text and all of the relevant sections of the comprehensive rules, and not really understand what a card does because Magic the Gathering cards do not exist in isolation. I'm just going to highlight a few examples where Witch's Oven might be useful beyond the obvious gaining 3 life in a pinch. There are game effects that care about the number of artifacts you control and care about artifacts entering the battlefield under your control, and Witch's Oven allows you to use 1 mana to convert a creature into 2 artifacts entering the battlefield under your control right now, and 0 mana to add 1 more each turn. You can sacrifice a creature between declaring it as a blocker and damage being marked. This means that you could use Witch's Oven to sacrifice a creature that was already going to be destroyed. If an opponent tries to exile a creature you control, you can sacrifice it first and send it to the graveyard and get the "a creature you control dies" trigger that exiling typically denies you. This also makes the creature available in your graveyard for other card effects. If an opponent casts a spell that targets a creature you control, you can sacrifice the creature and the spell will fizzle. The big one, though, is that there are a number of other cards in the set Throne of Eldraine that require you to sacrifice a food as a cost. One card in particular, Cauldron Familiar, interacts very well with Witch's Oven. Cauldron Familiar is a 1/1 black cat creature that costs 1 black mana to cast and has a beneficial enter the battlefield triggered effect. Each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And an ability that can be activated from the graveyard. Sacrifice food, return Cauldron Familiar from your graveyard to the battlefield. What this meant, in practice, is that you could block an opponent's attacking creature with the Cauldron Familiar each turn, then sacrifice it before damage was marked, then return it to the battlefield during your opponent's end step, which would gain you a life and cause your opponent to lose a life every turn for every Witch's Oven you control. Add something that can untap an artifact you control, maybe something that has a beneficial trigger whenever a creature you control dies, and maybe a way to get the pieces of your combo back onto the battlefield when the opponent manages to destroy them, and that life lost each turn starts adding up pretty quickly. The more Magic the Gathering cards you read and interactions you explore, the better you'll be able to understand how they all fit together to make a game that is somehow both infinitely complex and elegantly intuitive. This series keeps getting a few views a day, and each episode brings in a few more subscribers, so I keep making episodes. I'm still doing this for all of you people watching and commenting positively. I really like comments, actually, so I'm thinking I should do a better job of asking for them by saying things like, "Is there a Magic the Gathering card or game mechanic you would like me to make a future episode on? Please tell me about it in the comments." Subscribing to this YouTube channel, along with liking, sharing, and commenting on my videos, all serve to encourage me to keep making them. Reading Magic the Gathering cards is fun and all, but should you ever wish to learn to play Magic the Gathering, I've linked to a couple of places that might be helpful for that in the description. Thanks so much for watching.